Live. I hope we're using a new streaming technology this time because last week's recording quality was terrible, so we're mixing it up. If people are on the live stream and you can or can't hear or see anything, let me know. But you can't let me know because you couldn't hear that if it's bad. Anyway.
It still says 2 waiting. Now 3 watching. Now it's good.
3 watching. Okay. And there we are. Perfect. Oh, that looks nice and smooth. I like that. Okay, so this week we're talking about the national debt. So what is the national debt? What is it for? Why is it bad if there's too much of it? Is it bad if there's too much of it? We had one article that some of us read and a video that some of us watched. So I kind of want to start with a question and go around the room based on a quote from the article. So early on in the article it says, what is government debt and what's so bad about it? And I would add to that, and what does it have to do with basic income? So so let's go around.
We're going to go around and
start with Bethany. Yeah. What is government debt? What's so bad about it? And what does it have to do with basic income?
Okay. So I'd like to know a little bit more about what it is. I think the way that this article talked about it, it was the amount that we had borrowed from other places, possibly from our government as well, possibly within the government, the amount of bonds that are borrowed.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's just to other countries. I think it's both, right? The amount borrowed that hasn't been repaid, and presumably also with the interest as part of the calculation. I don't really know.
Usually the interest is not calculated as part of the number, as part of the debt.
Okay. Gotcha.
Certainly a concern. People are concerned about it.
What is bad about it? So I think people think of it like, I think the common argument for why it's bad is similar to why it would be bad to have a lot of debt yourself personally. That first of all, you have to pay this back instead of spending that money on other things. And second, it's accruing interest, so you're kind of paying back more than you borrowed. I think that's generally the logic among lay people for why it's bad. What does it have to do with a basic income? Well, we've talked about whether that's the right way to think about debt, and if it is, either way, debt could be one way that you were trying to fund a basic income. So whether accruing a lot of debt is a problem could relate closely to whether you want to fund your basic income through debt. So.
Okay. Brian.
I'll probably piggyback off that a little bit, but based on what you said last week, it seems that the national debt is just like the amount of money we've spent. It's just the amount of money that the government has spent on stuff and then not paid back. Like it's like a difference between the amount of money they've spent on different things, minus the amount of money that they've received from whatever sources, from other people maybe, or from taxes, like other people, other countries, or from taxes. Not really sure why it's bad. Just seems bad to have debt. Like I don't want to have debt, but it, again, based on what you said last week, it's sort of an indicator of surging money into the economy in some way. It's like the government has pushed this much money into the economy, at a global scale or a national scale. I don't really know. But I'd say, I guess it's bad because you are accruing interest and you're going to have to end up paying back more money than you started out borrowing. And then I'd say the link to basic income seems like if the government is the entity that will be supplying money for the basic income, then that's just more money they have to spend. But if we somehow, if we decide that the debt isn't so bad, then why does it matter if they're spending more money on the basic income for, the nation? But I definitely don't know that much of that.
Okay. Martin.
So the debt is not necessarily intrinsically good or bad, which I think is sort of comes through a bit in the article, that has utility and some good purposes, and maybe some other things about it are less certain. And but so I made a note to myself after I read the article, and I linked it back to a discussion that you and I had as we left a meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago. I don't know if I put it. Anyway, so the question of national debt, good or bad, national debt as any nation's debt. Our national debt, that is the United States national debt, the note I made to myself was so that the short answer to the question of how much debt is sustainable is simple. We don't know. And if we are close to the edge of some fiscal cliff, the market would warn us under ordinary circumstances. But these are not ordinary times. Due to the upheaval in all markets, there is a level of demand for treasuries that is, how should we put this, probably not justified by economic fundamentals. And as a result, market signals don't work as well as they should. And I think that was almost exactly my answer to you, when you asked me why was I concerned about the national debt. My concern about our national debt is the part about we don't know. And so anyway, and that's it, you don't know. So why would you get even, you might say even closer, why would you increase the national debt in a direction that keeps pushing you in this direction where you don't know what is going to happen? You have no historical basis to follow. It just seems like a completely unworthy risk for which you really can't find any good reason to do it. The only other caveat to that, I was sort of hoping Sultan was going to be here this evening. For any of you who sort of follow Bloomberg financial kinds of news and emerging markets, especially with Turkey being all over it with the speculations that its currency would crash, and just what would be the implications of that. That's not exactly national debt, and in fact Turkey is not actually among the countries that is sort of at the highest ranges of, say, debt to GDP and this sort of thing. But the issues are a little bit connected in the sense of this this uncertainty and what is going to happen. What will the impact be on most Turkish citizens should their currency collapse?
Okay. Richard?
I'll put it a different way than everyone else. Debt isn't good or bad, it's what you spend it on, and how what you spend it on could be used in the future. Like if you spend it on tax cuts, you're probably, from history, you're not going to get much of it back from it. But if you spend it on infrastructure, like back in the 50s, then you're going to improve the efficiency of your economy and get it back many-fold.
Okay.
Well, with basic income, how it implies to that is if you invest it in your citizens, they can improve their educational outcomes, or they can eat their school eat a meal in the morning rather than having to rely on like school lunches or anything like that. They can pay for their rent, so they don't have to be homeless. Your citizens are just more productive when you invest in them.
Okay.
Cool.
So yeah. So.
Do you want your mom to go? She's up on that.
We don't usually go around. I mean,
It's a small group.
Mom, you feel free to answer the question. So the question is, what is national debt? Why is it bad, and how is it related to basic income? And yeah, if you have some thoughts on that, please share. And meanwhile, I'm going to be writing a couple terms on the board. Because I think when we talk about national debt, a lot of times we're talking about two different things. And you've never heard these terms before because I just made them up tonight. But these are the two different things. There's, nobody's going to be able to see this, but you'll just remember that these words are up here. Budget debt.
That is a different marker.
It's not the marker, it's my hand.
Do you want me
budget debt, and market debt.
You could write it with your right hand.
Budget debt and market debt. So budget debt is exactly what Bryant was talking about. It's the amount of government spending that has exceeded tax revenues over the course of history. So it's just the cumulative deficits over the existence of the United States or whatever country we're talking about. So that's fairly simple and fairly straightforward. And then market debt has to do with treasury securities that we issue onto the market. So are you guys familiar with bonds, what bonds are? So quickly, a bond is just an IOU note. So it says, for example, I owe you $10 and I'm selling you this IOU note for $8. So then there's, $2 of interest rate you're going to earn on that in, say, a year or whatever. So part of the way the government raises money is they issue these IOU notes, these treasury securities, or sometimes they're called treasuries for short. They issue them into the market and they sell them in there, and there's a certain price, and whatever that price is, it determines the interest rate. So, if it's $8 and $2 of interest, if it's $7 and $3 of interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say that these two things are very different things. This is just accounting in terms of the budget. Budget debt is just, how much they spend versus how much they collect. And then market debt can kind of be controlled separately. So when the government issues market debt, when they issue treasuries, they sell them onto the open market. And one of the buyers in that open market is the Federal Reserve of the United States. So if we think of that as part of the government, then the government can control how much of this market debt is actually out there in the open market. So the amount of outstanding debt that people are kind of trading in the markets is somewhat independent of the size of the national debt. Now this is useful for monetary policy for various reasons, and so I just kind of want to get it. Yeah, go ahead.
So those things are independent because some of the budget debt ends up getting bought up by the government, basically? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, some of the market debt ends up getting bought up by the government.
So that's what's happening to the rest of the budget debt? Like, where is all the budget debt? Like, other than it just being a
So the budget debt is you're just subtracting tax revenues from spending and taking the difference. Now, they issue market debt as a way of justifying the budget debt, as a way of saying, okay, now we can spend this because we've issued this market debt. But then the amount of market debt that's actually out there in the world is completely determined by the Federal Reserve, and it doesn't really have very much to do with the amount of budget debt.
And that's because the Federal Reserve buys some of the market debt?
That's because the Federal Reserve buys some of the market debt. So if the price is getting too low, for example, then the Federal Reserve buys it up in the open market. Yeah, Brian.
Where does the Federal Reserve get money to buy things?
The Federal Reserve literally just creates the money.
Okay.
So what we think of as kind of base money in the economy, that's liabilities of the Federal Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
So they add the debt that they purchase to one side of their balance sheet, and then they add to their assets, and then they add the currency that they've issued to buy that debt as a liability. So now you've just created more money by creating more liabilities of the Fed. So this is printing money. It doesn't look like it because it looks like the government's borrowing, and they can only borrow so much, and there are market constraints on how much they can borrow, et cetera, et cetera. But really what they're doing is they're printing money when they spend more than they tax. And then the Fed can kind of control how much of that market debt is out there, and they can control the price of that market debt, et cetera, et cetera.
Why have any of it as market debt that isn't purchased by the Fed?
Why have any of it as market debt? Like, why doesn't the Treasury just print money?
Yeah, or why don't they buy it all? Or, how do they decide how much to have out on the open market versus?
Yeah, well, this has to do with monetary policy. So if you can get really good interest on government debt, on treasuries, you buy treasuries, that's an asset. It's a liability of the government, it's an asset on your balance sheet, so you're actually making that interest. Then that controls kind of the amount of currency that people want to hold in the economy and the amount of investment in private businesses, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, that's right. They use it as like a baseline interest rate or something.
Yeah, it's the risk-free baseline interest rate. So if anyone wants to borrow, in the economy, they have to borrow at a rate that's higher than the rate that the government is borrowing at. So this is a way of kind of controlling the amount of spending in the economy and keeping the currency stable.
So in this view, would it be accurate to say that the reason any of it's out on the market is not because they need to borrow the money on the market, but for these other financial purposes?
I would say ultimately that's the case. I wouldn't say that people think about it that way, and I wouldn't say that even the people doing this think about it that way.
Let me ask a follow-up question. So like, how much of it is political as opposed to these financial goals? Like it like looks different to be having some other countries loan us the money as opposed to printing it all ourselves.
I would say it's not very political. It just has to do with the conceptual understanding of how things work. So we think of the government as borrowing and issuing this debt onto the market, and that is how we're able to borrow. And then there's this concern that, oh no, what if there's no market for this anymore? Which really isn't possible because the Fed can buy it up.
Is there a canonical economic understanding of how much the Fed should buy versus how on the open market? Like how would they describe how they should have that balance?
Yeah, so the Fed all the time is tweaking interest rates, and that tweaks the amount of lending and borrowing in the private financial sector. Essentially, the amount of money that's being created in the private sector is the Fed tweaks by, buying and selling treasuries on the open market. So you hear the Fed is setting the interest rate at 1.25% or something like that, and that's not the rate that's on the treasuries, but it's related to that rate. So we can get into monetary policy and all of that. It's interesting and can get pretty complicated. But the basic idea is that the Fed, in controlling interest rates, they control the price of market debt and the interest rates on treasury securities, which is market debt. It's the same thing.
Your mom has some questions.
Yeah. Are we lending ourselves money with these bonds? Yeah, we basically are. So we're more accurately, we're lending onto the open market, and then some of the people who are lending to us, or we're borrowing from the open market, and some of the people lending to us are ourselves. Yes.
It sounds like lending to ourselves.
We are lending to ourselves. But we're also borrowing from other people,
right.
But only to the extent that interest rates are where we want them. Yeah. So if China wanted to sell all their market debt, all their treasuries, then the Fed would buy them up if the price of treasuries was going too low or something like that. Yeah.
China recently unloaded a considerable amount of U.S. treasuries. Who did they sell them to?
I mean, usually when you're selling these things, you're selling on the open market, so people are bidding prices. So I don't know, it's hard to say. Whoever wanted to buy them on the open market. Yeah, and some of that could have been the Fed.
And I think the Fed has been backing away from quantitative easing.
So the
Seems
Fed,
like they were probably not the buyer of it.
yeah, I mean, the Fed has been raising interest rates gradually, and they've been backing away from quantitative easing. The quantitative easing is more buying. So normally, what they do is they buy and sell short-term treasury securities, like when it's short-term debt, they call it a bill. So they buy and sell treasury bills. For quantitative easing, they were going into more like the longer-term debt and higher interest rate stuff, and then they were also buying corporate debt and backstopping some of those markets as well. So they are backing off from that. But even when they're raising the interest rates, they're still just adjusting the level, and then they're kind of maintaining it at that level. So if too much debt goes onto the market, they'll still buy it up to keep interest rates where they are. Does that make sense?
Too much debt.
Right, like we wouldn't call it a new policy. Like you could be backing off and trying to keep it at a certain level, but it would still be if a bunch comes onto the market, even just to keep it at that level, you have to buy that up. You see what I mean?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Who has to buy it?
The Fed would buy it up too.
So the Fed is committing to keeping short-term interest rates at a certain level, and as part of that commitment, they just follow an algorithm where if there's some kind of market pressure pushing interest rates away from that, they buy and sell treasury debt in order to bring it back where they want it to be.
Okay, so they probably do some of that. I mean, they do
Yeah.
a mix of all different kinds of things.
Yeah.
They also set the discount rate,
Yeah.
which is what probably most people think of when they associate the Fed with setting interest rates. The market is setting interest rates based on the rise and lowering of the sale price of government securities,
Yeah,
with an inverse relationship between the interest rate
and the price.
and the price.
Yeah. So I don't know what people are thinking of when they think of the Fed setting interest rates. They probably don't have like a clear, concrete concept of what's going on. The Fed does set the discount rate, and quickly just to tell you guys what that is, the discount rate is the rate at which you can borrow funds from the Fed overnight directly. No one's hardly ever borrowing at that rate because they're borrowing from each other in the
Well, the
market.
banks do it though.
The banks are borrowing from each other in the Fed funds market, which is direct borrowing between the banks. If someone has excess reserves, if someone needs reserves, they borrow from each other. That's different from the discount rate, which would be borrowing from the Fed. So the Fed sets a target Fed funds rate, which is really a market rate, but they're kind of influencing this market, and that's the rate that they talk about when they're talking about the Fed funds target. It's a market rate. It's not the discount rate, which is a separate thing. That's higher.
Mhm.
Discount rate is higher. Yeah.
The discount rate is kind of like a limit on what like the other one would be, right?
Yeah, if the market rate ends up pushing up against the discount rate, then people are going to be like, oh, okay, I'll just borrow straight from the Fed. Occasionally, the market rate will go a little bit above the discount rate because sometimes banks don't want to admit that they have to borrow from the Fed or something like that. So they'll borrow from other banks at a rate that's slightly higher than what they could get from the Fed. But that's just like details.
Minimal, yeah.
Yeah.
The money and banking class that he plugs all the time, by the way, like talks all about a lot of this stuff. I've started to go through it in a lot
Right.
of detail, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that's my answer to what the national debt is. It's actually two different things. We're talking about two different things, and often when we're talking about them, we're conflating budget debt with market debt. Like we're worried about the debt getting too high, and then we start talking about, the market for treasury securities, and really these two things can kind of be controlled independently by the government. And in terms of why it's bad, I would say that it's neither bad nor good, and there's no circumstances under which it's bad, and there's no circumstances under which it's good. I would say that simply, it's this mechanism. It's just information. Now we could ask how much money in the economy, or how much money creation is good, or how much money creation is bad. So when the government spends more money than they collect through taxes, they're creating money. That's money that wasn't in the economy before. And the specific mechanism is all this market debt and borrowing from the Fed and all of that. But that's just a detail. So the real question we should be asking is how much money creation is good in the economy and how much money creation is maybe too much. And I think that's kind of the question that basic income answers. So the idea is that if there's room in the economy for there to be more spending, for there to be more money, you can inject that money into the economy through a basic income, and then you can look at kind of the macroeconomic effects of the basic income. And when you start getting to a point where, okay, maybe now there's some inflationary pressure, now you're like, okay, the amount of spending in the economy is maybe sufficient. Yeah.
If someone was interested in this and wasn't considering a basic income, they were just considering like the other ways that the government spends, would you basically give them the same advice, like look for inflation?
I'd basically say the same thing. I mean, there are ways that the government can spend the money that have more effect on the economy or have less effect on the economy, kind of like what Richard was saying. So the government could spend money by, giving it to Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos just sits on it. That's not going to cause inflation or do anything good either. It's just kind of dead money that
Jeff Bezos would be happy.
It'll maybe make Jeff Bezos a little bit happier. He can brag about how much money he has, but it's not going to really change his behavior that much or his spending patterns that much. Whereas, if you give money to people who are actually going to spend it on production, so if you give money to a lot of poor people and stuff, that actually activates what's left in the economy, or kind of the productive capacity of the economy. But then if you do too much of that, then you start coming up against the limit of what the productive capacity of the economy is. But the whole point of basic income is to get the economy running at full speed for the benefit of everyone, so they can buy what we were already capable of producing. Yeah.
Can't you say that giving money to Amazon in order to whatever be more productive is the same as giving the same money to individuals to buy more things?
Yeah, so I would say no, because if you give the money to Amazon, they might be able to invest in technology and distribution and like really ramp up their operation. But they're only going to sell they're still only going to sell as much stuff as people are going to buy. So yeah.
Okay.
So you can invest in all these improvements to industry and stuff like that, but you're not going to see the results unless people are actually able to purchase the stuff that's being produced.
Yeah, of course.
But
Yeah.
they might. I could imagine they would go together. Like if you're increasing productive capacity, like that's gonna be one example of increasing productive capacity.
Yeah.
And then if you could potentially afford to give people more money to use to buy the products, is that accurate, Alex, in your view? Because now Amazon, like let's say you pump a lot of money into Amazon's infrastructure for whatever reason,
Yeah.
they can now produce more stuff. So you could
Yeah.
theoretically give people more
Well,
basic
could you
income.
just do that
Yeah.
infinitely?
To
That seems
purchase.
a little bit weird.
Well,
You can't do it infinitely. There's a limit to how productive Amazon can get.
And there's
And-
natural
yeah.
resource limits and
Yeah, sure.
labor
Yeah.
limits and there's various
Um,
limits. Yeah.
I would say that instead of doing this two-step process of giving money to Amazon first and then giving it to people, I would just give the money to people and then
see what happens.
see what happens.
Yeah.
And what's probably going to happen is
See how much they
they'll
buy.
buy stuff from Amazon, and Amazon will invest those profits to building up their stuff. And you just keep giving it to the people, and then the markets will determine where it goes
So
based
instead
on who's
of
worthy.
trickle down, it's trickle up.
It's trickle up. Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about
But
it.
you would
yeah.
you would have some exceptions, like with respect to investing in public goods like roads and all sorts of public goods, actually, right?
Oh.
Infrastructure public goods.
Yeah. Basic income isn't the only spending that the government should be doing. If you give everybody, like some money, they're not going to like band together and build the interstate system or the
Yeah.
bridge. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's fundamentally different. Giving money to Amazon is fundamentally different than giving it to, or than using it to build infrastructure, like
Right.
public infrastructure.
Yeah. Go ahead. Ricky.
Actually, in Africa, in like Kenya, they actually gave the people are spending their basic incomes to build like a post office because they didn't know that the people who were before, like people who were giving out like mosquito nets or whatever, didn't know that people wanted a post office.
Oh,
So
interesting. Yeah, so you actually could get people like trying to do government things, but it's harder. Like so you have to overcome public goods problems. Like everyone has an incentive to free ride. You have to get people to coordinate. You have to get people to like work together, and it can happen. But the government's already set up to do this exact thing. So it's easier, more efficient usually to use the government that's already there. I would argue than to try to get people to reinvent it. If there's one there, but if you don't have one, like it's guess that not strictly true what you said that it won't happen. Like he's saying, sometimes people
Yeah.
will kind of do it together.
There are some things we
Yeah.
know the government should be doing that are obvious, and then there are some things that we don't know. And once we reach the limit of the stuff we're sure about, it can make sense to see what the market does, to just give people the money and see
Like a
what the market.
Kickstarter type of thing.
Yeah. Or I was making a different point. I don't think I made it super clearly. I guess what I meant
Yeah.
is like under duress, like people may be able to do some of the functions of a government without an official government. Like they may be able to find other ways of solving the public goods problems and making infrastructure. Like
That's
the
called
post office.
volunteerism.
Yeah. But it's just if you already have a government set up, it's usually going to be more efficient to try to do it in that infrastructure you already have.
Yes, I think that's right.
That's
And in the absence of a proper government, what usually emerges is some kind of government.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's going to take time and be
Right.
difficult and yeah.
So,
Yeah.
quick question: Is it okay to equate issuing bonds with printing money just as concepts?
I think
it's kind of based on what you were saying up there.
I think the printing money is more just the government spending, is the printing of money.
Right. Oh, sorry. Then I should be more specific. Is it okay to equate the Federal Reserve buying up bonds with printing money? Or is that still not?
Yeah, I mean, people do. I think from the big picture kind of perspective, if you think of the government as one entity and the Federal Reserve is part of it, and then the Treasury is another part, like collectively together, the spending of money by the Treasury combined with the issuing of Treasury debt, combined with the Federal Reserve buying up that Treasury debt, collectively that's the government printing money.
Yeah, it's just a macro for printing money.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, that's exactly right.
That's cool.
So my mom is asking, would basic income take the place, or some of the place, of issuing securities, or just be an additional injection of money? So I would say that basic income doesn't take the place of issuing securities. Basic income has to do with the government spending, and the issuing of securities has to do with the government borrowing in the market. So you're gonna have, like, it's really, really useful to, instead of just directly printing the money and spending the money and saying, hey, we printed this money, it's really, really useful for the government to be issuing this market debt, these treasury securities, because that allows them to influence interest rates and influence the way in which people borrow and lend in the private financial sector. It allows them to kind of keep a handle on the economy. So I would not encourage just simplifying this and having the government print money directly, at least not for all of it, because then you lose control of monetary policy. These debt instruments, we talk about them as borrowing or how the government gets their money to spend, but really the most important function they have is in monetary policy, controlling interest rates.
Could you also kind of flip that over and just say that issuing bonds might be a way of funding a basic income, correct? Because if they're issuing bonds and people are paying for the bonds, then that's just. But I'm not sure how.
Yeah,
is me buying a bond from the government? How does that compare to me paying taxes to the government? I think that's the question.
It's similar. You're giving them money either way, but when you talk about either of those things, when you talk about taxes or the government being funded by bonds, then you're kind of answering the question of where does the money come from to fund the basic income. Whereas I think a more useful way to think of the basic income is that the economy can sustain a certain level of spending or can productively respond to a certain level of spending. And that's what ultimately kind of like determines how much basic income you can afford. And it's less about where you get the money, it's more about how much money can the economy take, how much can it handle without inflation. So I don't tend to think in terms of funding a basic income, and I don't know that asking where the money is going to come from is necessarily the right question to be asking when we talk about basic income. Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on the EU and the way they approached Greece and austerity program there? You might go as far back as Portugal. It's kind of one of the other.
Yeah, I think they made a mistake. I think they're trying to balance budgets and they're trying to. They're thinking about these fiscal budget restrictions, and in Europe, it's a lot trickier than in the United States because our central bank and our fiscal authority, our government, are kind of at the same level of the hierarchy. Whereas in Europe, you have a central bank that sits above all the countries, and they each have their own fiscal policy underneath. So it's not like this kind of symbiotic, coordinated thing that happens automatically in the EU. And I think that causes some problems. For Greece, generally speaking in the EU, I think the ECB should be printing more money and funding the deficits of the member countries more. Maybe not specifically targeting Greece, but just in general blanket, like basic income for the countries of Europe from the ECB, I think would be really effective in stabilizing their economy. Yeah.
And then you're thinking about it the same way. How much money can their collective European countries take?
Yeah.
In the collective European economy.
Yeah.
Inflation.
So why do you think they didn't do that?
And why did Greece specifically? Why did just one country kind of,
Well, there's various reasons for that, but there are other countries that were having problems, and Greece ended up being the worst of the bunch for a little while. And,
They're called the PIGS, P-I-G-G-S. It's Portugal, Italy,
Greece, Germany, and Sweden?
I think it was Ireland for a little while.
Ireland.
Oh,
yeah. P-I-I-G-S. I don't know what the G is.
Greece.
G is Greece.
Spain.
Yeah, Spain. Yeah.
Oh.
So there's kind of this in the European Union. You've got Germany and France, who are the really strong ones, and then you've got these countries that are kind of kind of on the
Peripheral.
other end struggling. And there's kind of this tension that's building over time because, and I think it's largely because the monetary policy is not controlled at the same level as the fiscal policy. Yeah.
Just on a side note, I don't want to get us into, I don't mean personal politics, but on a side sort of interesting political note, we have the same kind of issue in the United States, right, where we have like states that run more of a surplus and states that run more of a deficit, but you don't end up with quite the same tension that you might expect. In fact, the politics of the states that are running a deficit are often the most anti sort of government spending politics.
Right.
So it's kind of very different from Europe, I guess, because of what you're saying, because the overall policy and economics are on a more similar level.
So in the United States, we do have fiscal
Does that make
authorities
sense?
at the
Yeah.
state level, but we also have a federal level fiscal authority as well.
That sort of feels responsible,
Yeah.
maybe more responsible.
Go ahead, Mark.
There was a book called Strangers in Their Own Land.
Yeah, I
Did you
read it, yeah.
You read it? Okay, so that talks to exactly that point.
Yeah.
Although I'm not sure quite what you were saying in
I might
that,
not
in
have
the
been
sense
making
of,
sense, yeah, but I mean,
it's-
I can clarify. Go ahead, yeah.
it's very political.
Yeah, what I meant to say is like in Europe, I'm guessing, I don't know the European politics super well, but I'm like there seems to be some like maybe idea like resentment between Germany and France thinking maybe we shouldn't have to pay as much for these other countries, right? It's kind of a mentality.
Right.
So you might expect in the US that analog would be Massachusetts and New York feeling like we shouldn't have to pay so much for Alabama. And maybe you see that. I haven't seen that
Well,
much.
see, I would suggest that in the
Yeah.
United States, it's much more opaque.
Like where the money is
Like
going.
I believe there is I don't think it's that viable, but there was an actual secessionist movement in California.
Yep.
Okay.
We've seen the same thing happen in Canada, then that might, be a little bit less political, a little less driven by economics,
Right.
but these things do exist. And I think in Europe, because you have language differences, you have strong cultural differences, you have strong sensitivity to border.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
A border really means something, whereas in the United States, what was the last war between the states? Massachusetts and Maine, I guess, or
Did we have a war between
yes.
us?
So you just don't have that sensitivity, but in Europe, it's very visible, and and you're seeing it in Brexit, and you see it in sort of like the pushback against Brussels. It's like, okay, Brussels is this financial overlord, but I agree with you, there really isn't the same notion of a political overlord that is part of the EU, and so you see it become rather fractious.
Yeah.
And so again, though, my question would be, why didn't ECB? Why isn't it more? Why aren't Germans more tolerant, if for lack of a better word, of the Greeces of the EU or the Portugals of the EU? Why do they push back so strenuously? And if you're in Greece, you vilify Germany for this. But if you're Germans, it's like there's no way you're free riding on us. To many Germans' sensibilities.
Yeah, and I think it's because they don't understand some of the economics of how debt and deficits work, fiscal debt. I think they just don't, they think it's one way, but it's really another way, and that's why they're getting all fired up. I think the reality is that countries like Germany are, exporting a lot, and they're covering their fiscal balances by, money that they have lent to their customers, which are the other countries in the EU. So Germany, but the ECB and the European Commission, et cetera, and the IMF or whatever, giving money to Greece or lending money to Greece, and then Greece is using that money to buy stuff from Germany, and that's actually fueling the German economic success, in not just Greece, but all the other peripheral kind of European countries. And I don't think Germany recognizes that. Like, they think these countries are free riding, but really what you're doing is they're kind of doing something similar to providing a basic income to Greece, except they're resenting Greece for it. They're saying, here's some money that activates the European productive capacity. Now buy the stuff and also pay us back the money.
But isn't China doing that to the United States? in other countries as well?
Yeah, but China is not under the same fiscal or not under the same monetary authority as the United States.
I know, but
Yeah. So China's selling us stuff, and we're kind of getting mad about it in some ways. But it's not bad for us per se, because we can continue spending and buying from them as long as they keep their prices low.
and as long as they cover our trade imbalance by buying treasuries. And
Yeah.
it's the trade imbalance that has caused China to become the single largest holder
Yeah.
of U.S.
I mean,
treasuries.
so the reason they're covering their trade imbalance with treasuries is because they're getting all this, we're spending all this money, and they don't want to just sit on dollars. They want to they want to put those dollars to work and earn some interest, so they're buying treasuries with those dollars.
Oh, see, I don't agree with that.
No?
No.
Okay.
They're buying the treasuries because if you don't buy the treasuries in a free market,
Yeah.
in open market, their currency will appreciate. And so they buy the treasuries and they hold the treasuries as part of keeping the trade imbalance
yeah, keeping their
from
prices low.
driving their currency higher versus the dollar. And because if their currency appreciates against the dollar, the U.S. naturally
then they-
U.S. consumers will buy less
Right.
from the Chinese economy. And this is a lot of the tension over those, in fact, some, perhaps in the current administration more than others, who feel that China unfairly or unjustly manipulates its currency.
Right.
And there may be some unfair, you might say, kind of, or at least playing by a different set of rules than we think that we play by in terms of the artificially keeping their currency low versus the dollar. But a lot of it is their willingness to buy U.S. treasuries because you have to finance the trade imbalance somehow. Likewise,
Yeah.
a budget deficit, you have to finance it somehow.
Right. I think what you're saying is not incompatible with the stuff I've been saying. So essentially what this means is that China wants to keep their export prices low. They want to keep selling us stuff cheap. And all of this is kind of a result of that. So you could say, oh, they're willing to accept United States
selling
dollars.
us stuff.
They want to keep selling us
Cheap,
stuff.
they'd love to sell it for more, but they can only sell it for so much.
Yeah, right. So
If
they're
it's-
keeping it cheap
if
so
it's a
we
free
will buy
market.
it. Yeah, exactly.
Well, they only keep it cheap by keeping their currency low versus the dollar.
Yeah, these are two ways of saying the same thing.
But
yes.
and they're able to do
Yeah.
that by buying up our treasury bonds?
That is part of it, because
I
you
don't-
have
I
to
don't see
finance
it.
the trade
I'm
imbalance.
super
So essentially, if China wants to sell us stuff really cheap, they need to be willing to accept dollars, and they want to say, okay, we want all these dollars, so we'll make our stuff cheap enough, or we'll make our currency expensive enough, or our currency low enough that the prices you buy our stuff with is low. That was not a very good.
But how do
explanation.
they keep their I didn't understand
So,
how they manipulate.
If you think about it, if you're a person and you want to sell me a lot of stuff for really cheap, you have a lot of extra stuff, you're just quoting lower prices. So all of the stuff that Martin's talking about, these are all the mechanisms behind how China is able to accomplish that.
I didn't follow the mechanisms though.
So the mechanisms is just that, they're accepting a lot of money from us, and that money is, it's kind of it. The mechanism is just that they're accepting a lot of money from us, and if they're going to have that money, they're going to buy treasury debt. And they're not like making their businesses do this. So it's not like Martin said, it's not China going around saying, oh, businesses, you need to sell really cheap to America. It's China adjusting their monetary policy to make their currency very cheap to us, so then naturally the prices that the businesses in China sell to us.
I followed all of
Yeah.
that, but I didn't follow how they keep their currency low relative to ours.
So if China is, they basically use this kind of stuff, this kind of monetary policy. If they're, I don't know the extent to which them buying treasury debt does it. That certainly keeps. I think that would actually have the opposite effect. If all they're doing is buying treasury debt, that would lower interest rates in the United States, and it would cause people to want to buy assets in the Chinese currency. So if it was only buying the treasury debt, like if they just had an arbitrary amount of dollars, like a huge pile of dollars, and they just started buying up treasury debt, then I think it would actually push the Chinese currency up. It would appreciate the currency. Does that make sense? Because now you're lowering interest rates in American financial assets. So people would want to buy through carry trade, they would buy, Chinese financial assets, right? Richard.
I believe they peg their yuan, I think it is, against the dollar and make it automatically 8 yuan for $1 or whatever.
Right.
And that's how it has to be. It can't appreciate up or down. But if they can't do that, but if they let it, it seems that it keeps going up against the dollar.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to say what letting it just go really means, because there's no such thing as a currency that's not also maintained by monetary policy. So to say like what it would naturally do, there's no such thing as a kind of a natural currency that just does its own thing. Currencies are maintained by monetary policy. So it's more of a decision about how you want your currency to be moving relative to the other currencies, and it's not like everything's artificial. There's no like honest way of playing it. You can always say like, oh well, this price reflects a certain decision by the monetary authorities, and you can agree with it or disagree with it, but it's not. Yeah.
And would you say that's because like absent monetary policy, there would just be too much change?
Absent monetary policy, any market forces, currencies
right.
just
That's
wouldn't
what I
work.
meant by too much change. Like because the prices would change.
The prices would change, and then someone would come up with the idea of monetary policy and
Right.
introduce a new
No,
currency.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I was just trying to make it explicit what you were
Yeah.
talking about in terms of.
Yeah. So in terms of like the individual mechanisms, I have to think about that a little more. But my intuition is that if all they had was a pile of dollars, and it was just they had a pile of dollars sitting there, and they bought treasury debt, that would actually cause the yuan to appreciate, not depreciate. But the fact that it's combined with they're sucking in all these dollars, and they have monetary policy that's go ahead, Richard.
Oh, there's I've been hearing about how China is buying all these American companies, and that's how they're getting money into the manipulating their currency and whatnot, like buying like Heinz and whatever.
Yeah, so I would say the reasoning for that is similar. So you've got all these dollars that you're getting from all your exports, and the reason you are able to export that much stuff is because you're keeping your currency low using monetary policy. But now you have all these dollars, and you want to invest them in something. So some of it's treasury debt, and some of it's U.S. companies, U.S. real estate, that kind of thing. If they want to be a little riskier and get a higher return. Yeah.
Were there things back in the article or the video that you want to talk about? I know we've kind of gone off on it.
Yeah. So let's watch the video.
The whole video.
The whole video.
It's
not
only
very
like
long.
5 minutes or
Yeah. So let's see. Hope the sound works.
Hello, welcome Renegade Inc. This is a Renegade Short, and it's on the subject of whether we should be running government surplus or not. We're here with Professor Steve Keen. He's going to walk us through it. Steve, I'm going to come with this argument. We should run a government surplus. It's a good idea because the government then can invest, they've got more money, they tax us less, etc.
Yep.
Is that the case?
No, unfortunately. Wish it was that simple. But I think with people, what people do is they think like their own household, where they can actually spend less than they earn, and it all works out nice and easily.
So is this extrapolating a household budget into a government budget?
And that's the area everybody's doing. So let's actually think at the scale. We talk about an entire economy, and we say let's divide it into and call it the private sector and the government sector, and see what actually is involved if the government's going to run a surplus. Now, for it to run a surplus, it has to tax you more than it spends on you.
No, I don't like the idea.
Okay, what happens as a result is, let's say it's a £50 billion surplus, then that means they're taking £50 billion out of circulation.
So that's money out of the economy.
Which can also mean if the money turns over twice a year, they can reduce total spending by £100 billion.
Right.
So you've actually reduced GDP and reduced the amount of money in circulation.
So when that money is taken out, where does the private economy go to make up the shortfall?
Well, what they've done, they've gone to the banks and they've borrowed from the banks, either households or firms. And if you just borrow and simply keep it constant, then you have a 50 billion increase in your money from the bank, credit which you can spend, but that credit causes an increase in the level of debt you owe.
What sort of debt?
Private debt. Right. And this is what's exploded, and this is what's caused the financial crisis, and that's what's caused the current slump in the economy.
So we can get historical context. Let's just have a look at the private debt from the UK, specifically private debt from the 1800s.
What you see is that the data starts in 1880. From 1880 and 1980, there's no trend. There's booms and slumps overall, but there's no trend in the level of private debt. It stays below 75% of GDP.
Yeah, but there's some irregularities here. What's happened?
Then in 1980, 79, 80, we have a new conservative government that believes that we should treat the economy like a household and tries to run surpluses and liberates the financial sector to let capitalism rip. What actually happened from that point is that it wasn't capitalism that ripped, it was the financial sector. We went from a debt level of 55% of GDP to 195% back in 2010. And from that point on, nobody wants to borrow any money anymore, credit demand has evaporated, and we're in an almost permanent slump.
So while we're looking at graphs, let's quickly look at the US. When the US did try to run surpluses or run surpluses, what happened?
Well, it's over 120 years of data, it's run surpluses sustained on two occasions. The first in the 1920s, and that led to the Great Depression because the money coming out, people borrow from banks, speculate on stock market bubbles, then it crashes, you've still got the debt. We had the Great Depression. The second occasion was under Clinton.
Right.
What looked like responsible spending was actually taking money out of the private sector, who borrowed from the banking sector to speculate on housing, drove up the debt, and we then had the crisis of 2007, 2008.
So as we stand here today, the government want to run a surplus. The Conservative government in the UK think a government surplus is a good idea. What's your message?
It's the wrong idea because to actually have a monetary economy, your money factories have to be producing more money for us to spend.
What's the element that's missing here?
What we're listing out is the government is the only institution that owns its own bank, the central bank. And the central bank finances what the government wants to do and can finance it indefinitely so long as we continue accepting British pounds as forms of payment within Britain, which we do. So if the government runs a deficit, it's actually injecting money into the economy. And unlike money coming from the banking sector, it doesn't come with an obligation to repay. It comes with an obligation to pay tax, but not to pay it all back.
Right, so it's actually a sleeping giant.
Yeah. This is the way we could actually finance, for example, university education.
So when journalists persistently ask the Labour opposition at the moment here in the UK, they say to them, how are you going to pay for it? What's your answer? Tuition fees, for instance, they want to scrap all tuition.
The government runs a deficit financed by the central bank, spends money into the economy, it stimulates the economy, and it gives us an educated youth that are not encumbered by private debt as they are under the current scheme.
It's a decent investment idea.
Yeah.
Lastly, a government surplus a good idea?
No. Government is one of our two money factories. A government running a surplus is a government destroying money and telling us to grow at the same time.
Thanks for clearing it up. That's it, Renegade Inc. This is a Renegade Short. This was Steve Keane, and a government surplus. It's a terrible idea.
That's exactly the diagram you drew. I mean, you drew a simplified version last time.
Right.
The government has to be red so that everyone else can be black.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
If I'm going to boil it down like a lot.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah.
So, can we walk through in a little more detail? He talks about how, at a certain point, the market for debt kind of evaporates, and then you end up with like a recession or a crash.
Yeah. So the idea is that just because the government isn't giving people spending money doesn't mean they're not still going to try to spend. So what happens is they borrow in order to be able to spend. And in order to keep the economy going, the central bank is going to make sure that people are able to borrow enough to keep consumer spending at high enough levels to keep the economy going, to keep the currency stable, et cetera, et cetera. So by foregoing too much public debt, too much national debt, now you're incentivizing more debt in the private economy of people borrowing from each other. And that can get really unstable because now you've got all these kind of interlocking, interconnected debt obligations where if someone defaults on their debt, that can cause a kind of a cascade reaction like we saw in 2008.
But that seems different from what he was saying.
Yeah.
He said something about the market for like people being saturated in the amount of debt they wanted to take on or something like that. Maybe I misheard him.
Yeah, I don't know what he said exactly, but I think, maybe what he's referring to is that the central bank lowers interest rates all the way to zero, and there are still people who want to spend more, and you can't lower them below zero. So now you're no longer able to continue funding everything by just borrowing more in the private economy, and then, then you have, go ahead,
So
Brian.
there has to be a thing that prevents that little circle that he drew from just being an upward spiral forever, and that thing would be inflation. Or you can't just continue to print new money out of thin air, right? He talks about a money factory, so like what's the ceiling? What's the restriction?
Yeah, so what matters for inflation, like I was saying last week, is the rate of spending in the economy.
Yeah.
So as the money accumulates, that's no longer money that's affecting prices anymore. As Jeff Bezos accumulates the money, he might be buying treasury securities or some other investments or something like that, but he's not buying hot dogs.
Yeah.
So in terms of the spiral, are you talking about just the spiral of the government continuing to add more money to the economy?
Yeah, and then I think what you might say in response is that it gets to a point where just individuals have more money than they can actually spend on things that are being produced by, companies.
Yeah, and then that would cause inflation. But it's less about the amount of money and more about the rate of flow of money into the economy.
Oh, okay.
So if the factory is producing at a constant rate, and that's the rate that the economy can sustain, then you can just keep printing money and adding it to the economy at that rate.
Yeah.
Where you get into problems is if you're adding money at a rate that's greater than the rate of spending that the economy can productively respond to.
So it's first derivative.
Yeah, first derivative.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think I had something. That's fine. Yeah.
For the private debt kind of spiraling, that's just kind of the fragility of all the interlocking debt obligations.
It seems like the government running or attempting rather to run a surplus is just trying to force that spiral in the other direction. Maybe, but it seems like he was saying it just shifts all the debt goes into the private sector.
Right. So you have the two money factories. There's the government printing money, and then there's Wall Street or the financial sector, increasing the amount of finance and lending and stuff like that. So you've got these kind of two sources of money. And if one of them gets too small, if the government is not adding enough money to the economy, then the other one grows too big. And that's what we saw, like in the run-up to 2008. Now, we weren't running a surplus, for a little while.
Please. In the run-up to 2008, what?
In the run-up to 2008, the government wasn't spending enough money into the economy, so that caused the Fed to incentivize money being created in the private financial sector, and it turned out through the housing market. Now, most of that was not useful to people buying ordinary things, but in order to get some amount of money trickling out of the financial sector into consumer pockets, they had to kind of create this bubble in the housing market. And they didn't know it was going to appear in the housing market or what it was exactly going to look like, but it's monetary policy, not having interest rates high enough, incentivizing the spending that's needed just to keep the economy going. If the government had been spending money and running a bigger deficit during those years, then monetary policy could have been a lot tighter, and people could have, used the money that the government was throwing at them instead of borrowing or instead of taking out mortgages and stuff like that.
You know what they say, put all the economists in the world end to end, they still couldn't reach a decision. So there are going to be some different points of view. To your
there are.
How you see
my point of view is not the standard point of view on this at all. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at
The Big Short. Okay, so somebody else has read The Big Short.
Yeah. So the Big Short is, I think they saw part of the picture. They saw the part of, the speculation driving, the kind of the unsustainable debt bubble and all of that. But they didn't see that it was ultimately caused by the government not spending enough money. Yeah. But the part of the picture that they saw was correct.
I'm having difficulty with the idea that the 2008 credit crisis could have been prevented if the government was running larger deficits.
Yeah. A lot of people are going to have trouble with that. I would argue the same thing is true of the Great Depression.
The run-up to the Great Depression or the actions of the government after the Great Depression?
I would say both. I would say if the government had been running more of a surplus, especially if they had been, providing a high
surplus.
You need more of a deficit.
Or sorry, if the government had been running less of a surplus, more of a deficit, and they had been, funding, something like a basic income, you never would have had the runaway stock market bubble and all of that, real estate in Florida or whatever. But I also think as a response to the Great Depression, they, after a couple of years, they tried to balance the budget and just made it worse. They could have. I think in response to 2008, we did a lot better than we did in response to the initial shock of the Great Depression with our monetary policy. And that prevented us from having another Great Depression.
In 2008?
2008, yeah.
Much
better response.
Being that $700 billion, is that what you're referring to?
So the fiscal stimulus, which was the government spending more, and then also monetary policy, not trying to raise interest rates back too soon, keeping it low, quantitative easing, all of that stuff helped. Yeah. I do think the basic income would have been better, but this stuff helped. Yeah.
Well, so at the risk of oversimplification, because I talk about Stockman's take on all this stuff quite a bit, not because I necessarily agree or disagree or whatever. It's just it is a bit of a contrarian point of view, and it has some utility in the way I like to think of. If you really want to learn about something, try to compare and contrast different things. From that comes learning. The answer may not come out of it,
right,
but you'll certainly sort of have expanded your learning around an issue. So Stockman, simply stated, would suggest that the Great Depression came on the heels of protectionist policies that effectively shut down international trade, for which the United States was particularly sensitive to. Now you had all of this capacity that had been supplying world markets that in an era of protectionism, and the United States, Taft-Hartley, and our own, shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak,
right.
Instead of promoting trade, we were actually part of the process of reducing international trade. We have all this capacity, which became excess capacity when it couldn't sell into the world markets, and that led into the Great Depression. And then, I have to kind of go back and review the book, but then you get into this area of banks and bank failure in the sense of Wall Street versus Main Street. That they're not necessarily exactly the same thing.
Right.
And what Stockman would say was, I believe he would say, was wrong about what was done in 2008 was that there was a Wall Street problem but not a Main Street problem, and that what the government effectively did was solve the Wall Street problem for Wall Street Whereas the correct approach should have been, let the markets fix Wall Street. If the markets fix Wall Street, there won't be another 2008 crisis,
Yeah.
because they'll have gotten burned badly enough that they won't, and with nobody to rescue them, they
Yeah.
won't let the kind of subprime mortgages that form tranches in CDOs that then get rated as AAA when there's no way the debt was AAA. But
Yeah.
they didn't have to own up to any of that
So-
sort of systemic failure, because the government rescued Wall Street at the expense of Main Street.
Yeah. So just to be clear, the AAA stuff didn't fail during 2008. It was all the lower quality subprime stuff, lower rated stuff that failed, and then people were unable to fund, all kinds of stuff throughout the financial sector, and it all kind of came crashing down. But nobody defaulted on
Mortgage
AAA
rates
stuff.
were not high enough. So
Right.
low
So-
mortgage rates encouraged real estate speculation.
Yes.
That drove up real estate prices, and then there was not the quality real estate to support the mortgages.
Yes.
That was what the bubble was.
Yes, I agree. So I think everything you're saying is exactly right. Quickly to the protectionism during and before the Great Depression, I think that was certainly a big factor, and I think Smoot-and-Hawley was in the beginning of the Depression. It was after the Depression started, and that just kind of made things worse. Getting more protectionist and all of that, and part of that was related to trying to protect the gold standard, which I think was a mistake. We were the last ones to get off the gold standard, so that was kind of fueling some of this. It's not the whole story, but it's a big part of the story. For 2008, I think everything you're saying is right, except I would emphasize that Main Street depends on Wall Street. That if Wall Street goes away, Main Street's going to have problems. So you can't just have like a problem with Wall Street and have that correct itself without having some kind of spillover into Main Street. I would agree that the way we handled it was not optimal. I think the best way to have handled it would have been to have had, a basic income, and then, Main Street won't depend on Wall Street as much anymore if there is a basic income, that kind of thing. So we don't need, there's a reason why interest rates were so low, and that's because, our monetary, our central bank was deciding to keep interest rates that low because that's what the economy needed. If interest rates had been higher, that would have been bad for Main Street sooner. So you can't just do all this through monetary policy. You need the fiscal stimulus, and the central bank was trying to make up for the government just not spending enough money. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I don't
Yeah.
completely agree with it, but it does make sense.
Yeah.
I think the relationship between Main Street and Wall Street, there is a relationship between Main Street and Wall Street. Main Street is better off when Wall Street is disciplined by the markets. And that was part of what was breaking, and you can look at it other ways too, federal regulations and all that. And these are all parts, and we're going to probably the whole discussion on all that. But I think what the likes of a Stockman would contend was that Wall Street then and now,
Yes.
he probably, we've gotten, look at this, I don't go out there often, but usually once every 3 basic income meetings, I go out to just refresh myself on what's Stockman. No, it's that you had an undisciplined Wall Street, and
Yes.
it wasn't disciplined by the market, and then it wasn't disciplined by the government either, because they bailed it out.
So the question is, why wasn't it disciplined by the market? And I think the answer is because monetary policy was expansionary or loose monetary policy was allowing the credit markets to expand and keep interest rates low, injecting money in there, and they were doing that for a reason.
So the part
yeah.
where I say that Wall
Yeah.
Street wasn't being disciplined by the market
Yeah.
is because the credit rating agencies, and honestly, most of these things I come from the approach of, there aren't quite as many villains
Yeah.
out there. It's just we're all dumber than we really think we are.
I think I agree
So
with
we
that.
do a lot of dumb stuff because human and we're
Yeah.
stupid, okay? And then, you know, still evolving, hopefully. But maybe, you know, a little bit, but there was the information system, which should have been reflected in interest rates, wasn't working. And the system didn't work because because the rating agencies had conflicting interests in what they were rating, and so they had an interest
Yeah.
in not rating CDOs what they really should have been rated, and that created a very opaque situation where interest rates, home mortgage rates, these kinds of things were not what they should have been. What
Yeah.
a really healthy and completely transparent market would have set them higher, and presumably there would
So-
not have been the real estate speculation.
I think you're right about all of this stuff going on with the perverse incentives and even some level of corruption within the system, and just like the opacity and everybody doing their own part, and then collectively it's, you know, it's a disaster. But I would argue that even if you'd fixed all that stuff, you'd still have the same thing. You'd just have it be more transparent, and it would be more obvious what was going on, because the Fed isn't looking at you know, the behavior of individual ratings agencies. What they're looking at is consumer spending and, you know, interest rates and stuff like that. So if the ratings agency had been functioning properly, the interest rates would have probably just ended up about where they were, and consumer spending would have stayed where it was, because it's where it needed to be for, you know, the mainstream economy, or mainstream
Why do you
economy.
say that?
Yeah.
You say interest rates would have stayed where they were? Or you don't think that mortgage rates and subprime rates would have not been higher?
No, because if there had been pressure to push those interest rates higher, you know, the Fed would have said, "Oh no, now people aren't able to finance their borrowing, so we're gonna go into the market and push interest rates in the other way."
That was the problem. They shouldn't have been able to finance their borrowing. That was the breakdown in the
Well,
market.
I mean, that's a
to-
moral judgment that they shouldn't have been able to, but people needed to be able to buy their houses, so the Fed was making decisions.
But
Yeah.
people weren't buying houses to live in. They were buying them to flip and
So
Speculation.
to speculate.
a small percentage were buying, you know, houses to live in, and, you know, the same policy that's going to make it easier for people to buy houses to live in creates way more of this other speculation
So I
stuff.
think this gets
Yeah.
to the heart of like,
Yeah.
because I've talked to Alex, you know,
Yeah.
offline too about this, to your view on like why this is an inefficient way to achieve a certain goal. So
Right.
Alex has this view that like the goal that they're trying to achieve is like getting spending money to people, like to actually buy houses, to buy products, and if they don't do that, you know, the economic markers that they're looking at are going to start going in negative directions. But the tools are limited, right? Like the tools are limited. What can they do? They can mess around with interest rates, and that affects not only the spending they're trying to affect, but all these other things like flipping houses and like all of this
Right.
credit bubble stuff is happening because the only tool they have is this incredibly imprecise tool where like only some of it trickles down to the actual
Right.
consequence that they're trying to have. Which is why Alex's view is that it really needs to happen in the branch of the government that has more flexibility, like the Congress.
Where the money,
Yeah,
deciding where the
exactly.
money goes. Yeah.
Does that kind of help? Yeah. I don't
Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, my grandmother had an expression called being educated beyond your intelligence, and that means that people think that they know about all these things, and like the president, he has a degree from was it Wharton or whatever in the University of Pennsylvania, and so he has an economics degree, so he thinks that he knows about like tariffs and things, but he has no idea about and there's also an issue with the revolving door between government agencies and the financial sector and whatnot. And it's like they don't want to, some person in a powerful position doesn't want to punish the financial agencies, because afterward they'll get all this payoff. They'll get a sinecure, which is a position where they don't have to do anything. They get a lot of money for it.
Yeah, that's politics though, I think almost purely, right?
Yeah.
So I think I have to. So what you are saying is
Yeah.
that if the government made it to where the interest rate on their treasuries was moving, if they push that up, then it would de-incentivize people to flip houses. Is that kind of like the connection?
Yeah.
Okay, and then and then also to step back to this this analogy of like two different money supplies, you would say that the lead up to 2008 or 2008 itself, whatever, around there, is an example of the government's money supply becoming too small relative to. I'm using money supply in a non-technical way because I don't actually know what it means, but
That's fine.
Too small relative to the money that private banks are pushing out.
Yeah.
Okay.
And not only that, but I would say that it's historically been too small. The government hasn't been spending enough money, and as a result, you get this kind of buildup in the private financial sector, and you get these booms and busts. And I mean, this is what causes what they call the business cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was also on my mind. It was like, it's been 10 years. Don't these people say every 10 years we have one of these?
You can't predict it.
Yeah, no, I know, but I'm saying based on historical data, is that not like a generally accepted thing or not? Maybe it's
We
not.
do
It's
different
consensus.
things every time, so it's really hard to say. Yeah. It really depends on our economic policies and stuff like that. You can't just like, it's not like a natural cycle or something.
It's kind of tricky with.
Yeah.
It's kind of tricky with Alex's view, I think, because it's like one step above. So, like, let's say that one part of the financial sector was really well regulated, then you might see the bubble, like, I presume, pop up in a different section. So, kind of like hard to tell.
If you're worried, if you're going to stop any bubble you see from happening using regulation and policy or something like that, then some bubble somewhere that's opaque that people aren't really aware of is going to emerge. So that opacity is going to emerge somewhere in the system, just not the places you're focusing on.
I think this is just like the distinction between your view and like maybe more common views. I don't know if your view is common, but more common views that it has to do with like specific breakdowns in regulation or just perverse incentives. Alex kind of has this view that actually no, there's like a government pressure by design to increase private lending in a certain way to get money down to people, and that actually creates the incentive for a lot of this stuff that looks like just other like regulation problems or greed to other people. I think that's, but I don't hear very many other people articulate. Probably other people do articulate that view, but that's kind of what's somewhat unique about how you talk about it.
Yeah, I think Perry Maryland talks about this a little bit. He's the instructor for the Economics of Money and Banking course, and he talks a lot about shadow banking and the regulations on banks, and then these other entities that kind of perform banking services end up emerging because now there's a market for that. And if you kind of like squeeze down on, I think he says it's like squeezing a balloon, like you squeeze one area and then it pops out the other side and that kind of thing.
So you're saying that you actually can't treat the private sector as like a monolith when you're dealing with all this stuff? You're saying that a bubble might pop up in a specific area in the private sector. If you want,
You can't solve this through regulation because there's greater economic forces at work.
That I think I understand. Yeah.
There's like the problem of getting money to people, the way that you see it, that like remains, and so regulation alone can't solve that problem. But I think
regulation can have to target like certain. I don't know. You have to classify things to regulate.
Right, like what's a bank and what's not.
And then new markets for new things appear.
But that doesn't mean that there isn't good regulation to be had in the financial sector, probably, right?
There's good regulation to be had, but I can tell you the way not to do it is to regulate specific things, and then there's innovation, and then you regulate those specific things, and then you just like have like regulation proliferating everywhere. That's just
that's what I mean by the categorization problem. When you have a new thing come up, you gotta like figure
a
out
patchwork quilt.
How else do you
Piecemeal.
I think you can regulate for transparency and like the stuff Martin's talking about, and make things more visible. I think in terms of regulating what people are allowed to have on their balance sheets and stuff like that, I think that's a little bit of a losing battle. And mostly monetary policy can influence the size of everything. So you want a transparent market as much as possible, but ultimately it's like monetary policy pulling the levers at like the large scale, and that can take care of like a lot of the stuff that we try to take care of through regulation. But monetary policy isn't going to do that if there's not enough money flowing into the economy in other ways. Instead, they're just going to let the financial sector rip, like Steve Keen was saying.
Right. And it doesn't look like an unbalanced budget, just to bring it back. like they don't get the political problems of having an unbalanced budget if the financial sector is doing the work for them.
Yeah, if you're the government and you want to balance your budget, then you can let the monetary authorities make the mess. You can let the central bank make the mess, or clean up the mess, or both, and that's you get a business cycle. Yeah.
Martin, were you saying earlier that there's I'm trying to figure out where you guys like differ. Were you saying that there's nothing the government could have done to prevent? Well, I guess that's not what you were saying, but you just had a different mechanism for, the appropriate response by the government
In 2008?
Yeah, to prevent it, or to, let's just say to prevent it, because I think the before and after are probably two different things. So focus on the before. What? Because my understanding of his position is that if before it happened, if the government had manipulated their treasury interest rate a little bit higher, then it would have de-incentivized people to buy houses in order to flip them. And then, but I'm wondering, what do you think about that? Or do you agree with that statement? Or am I even making sense?
So, what I'm saying, one way of looking at the run-up to the 2008 crisis, that is the bubble in real estate, is that if mortgage rates had been higher, there would not have been as much speculation in real estate, and the speculation became self-fulfilling prophecy. So in other words, I buy and a lender is willing to lend to give me a mortgage because the lender is convinced that the real estate is going to be worth more
because the
in the
interest
near
rate's
future.
higher. Yeah, because they're
Not because of the interest rate, because of this, because you see
you're
a
speculating the
constantly
value is
increasing
gonna go
value of real estate,
okay.
but it's speculative real estate value increases.
Okay, so I guess
It's
I
not
understand the
an
speculation
increased
part.
demand in the number of people
Yeah.
who need homes, and we haven't built enough homes. I mean, you could also build more homes, and that's going to increases the supply of homes, and therefore reduces the price of
So
homes.
then how does the interest rate on mortgages factor into what you're talking about?
So what happened was as far as subprime mortgages goes and CDOs, is that low quality debt was incorporated into collateralized debt obligations with higher quality debt, but the rating agencies simply stamped the entire CDO as if it was all high quality debt.
And
all
when you use high
AAA.
quality and low quality, you're from the perspective of the lender, correct? The person lending the money.
The
So
perspective of the lender
so high quality
being
debt.
likely to be repaid.
Oh, so it doesn't have to do necessarily with the interest rate on the loan. It's like the likelihood that the specific person is going to pay you back in full, or is it kind of a combination of those two things?
It's a combination of those things.
Okay.
The interest rate, you're going to charge a higher interest rate if you think there's a higher risk that you won't be paid back.
Oh wait, that's right. There's a correlation there too. All right,
Yeah.
I think I'm getting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
It actually has to do with Fannie Mae or Simon. I don't remember which one it is, but the government said to prioritize giving out home loans to people with low incomes, and people like my grandmother's neighbor. Well, he wrote out all these loans to these people by faking their incomes, and they so that they would be able to buy these homes, and there was no way for them to pay it back, but they received a commission on that house.
Yeah, that's the story in this Big Short. I saw the movie, not read the book, but yes, that's kind of like
That's part of the story in The Big Short.
yeah.
It has to do with
It's like showing
actors in
that-
certain parts of the system having these incentives and then like when you combine all their activity together.
So you
Yep.
think
Oh,
these
yeah.
people's income to be higher than it actually is, which means that they should get a better interest rate, lower interest rate on their mortgage, right? And then
Right.
when in fact, so you're like tricking the rating agency in doing that, right? Because they see just the numbers and they're like, oh, this is a good loan because it's more likely to be paid back because on paper it says this person makes more money than they actually do.
Right.
Okay.
And a lot of
Well,
times
that's clear fraud, but there was a lot of
Yeah.
fraud.
there was a lot of fraud too.
Right.
But some of it was not fraud, like,
Mm.
I
Well, the
struggled
whole
to find this
packaging
one
thing.
study, and I know I read it, and I didn't make a note. Somebody did a study of, it was probably around Wall Street and investment bankers and CEO, and what they were looking for was, did the people who played central roles in the whole machinery, if you want to look at it that way, leading up to 2008, did they believe that they were playing a game of musical chairs, that they knew what was going to happen and they just wanted to make sure that they were in a position not to get burned when it happened?
That's an interesting
Or did they feel that they were participating in a system that was working and didn't expect anything to ever go wrong? And the proxy that they used for whether or not they thought something would go wrong or not was what was their own personal buying behavior, particularly with respect to real estate and taking out large mortgages. That, did they feel like their income was going to be completely steady and they had nothing to worry about? And that, in fact, is what their buying behavior was. That these folks, I'll say these folks, Wall Street and bankers, investment bankers, and all that, they were not acting like they expected the bottom, like they knew that they were doing something unseemly and they needed to be really careful because they knew the bottom was going to fall out, and they just needed to make sure they weren't holding the
So
bag when
they
it
were
happened.
comparing the talk and the walk of these people.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And it matched.
And it matched.
And it matched, implying that they were just naive to the imminent crashing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, that to me supports your side a lot more, just because they were just playing the game as the rules were set, and if it supports your argument for the Fed manipulating their treasury rate higher, their treasury interest rate higher. I think
Lower actually, or actually it's the government not spending enough money, so then the Fed has to lower interest rates so people can borrow more to be able to spend. to
Oh
make up
wait,
the gap.
no. When I say raise the interest rate, I meant raise the interest rate on the bonds, because
Raise the
then,
price, you mean?
No, because I thought that if bonds have a higher interest rate, that means they have a higher. I mean, they're going to pay you back more
Yes.
after when you buy them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So if
After-
bonds have a high interest rate, then you're not going to lend to people so they can buy houses. You're just going to buy the bonds.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So if the bonds have the lower interest rate, then that creates more incentive to do this other kinds of lending in the economy, including more.
It creates an incentive for the private banks to do this with
Yes.
lending. Okay.
Instead
yeah.
of just buying government debt.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. And to be clear, I agree with everything Martin's saying.
Hmm.
Basically, I just have a story for why interest rates were so low that has more to it than just the perverse incentives and corruption and fraud and stuff like that. Yeah. Let's look at some quotes from the article. So the first one that I noticed, or that I took note of, was this is toward the beginning. They're saying another way to close the budget gap is for the Federal Reserve to print another 100 billion or so, but that can lead to inflation. So that in my mind leads to two questions, some of which we've covered already. The first question is, does printing money always lead to inflation? Under what circumstances will it lead to inflation? And then the second question is, in the grand scheme of things, is borrowing money any different than printing money? So I think you guys know my answers to these questions. I don't know if anyone wants to say.
I'd say your answer to the first question is you can, there gets a point where you have too much of a good thing. So you can print money up until you see market. I guess I'm going to keep using inflation. It's just like the simplest one for me to understand. Until you see these markers just go the wrong way or start to turn the other way.
Right.
And the second one, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so I think that's right. For the first one, I would say that initially printing money does a couple of things. It activates productive capacity in the economy that was previously going unused. And it also allows the Fed to tighten the monetary policy a little bit, because if people are getting more spending money from the government, then they don't need as much spending money from borrowing in the private financial sector. And when I say people, I mean businesses as well, and et cetera, et cetera. So it allows interest rates to go higher, and helps prevent things like 2008. Yeah, so that's the first thing, and then it eventually will lead to inflation once the spending is beyond what the economy can sustain. Another thing it could lead to is perhaps interest rates get too high, and you're like, I don't want interest rates to get any higher than this, so I'm not going to print as much money, because the printing of the money incentivizes the Fed to raise interest rates. So there is a limit to how high we want interest rates too.
So whose interest rates? You mean like the interest rate of just a typical loan from a private bank? When you say interest
rates? So interest rates are kind of correlated. They're not exact. They don't move in lockstep, but they're kind of correlated.
No, I know that, but I'm
economy.
wondering.
Yeah.
I guess I might have been conflating those then. There's the interest rate on a loan that I would get from Bank of America, and then there's the interest rate on a bond that I would buy from the government.
So usually
maybe you don't say interest rate for that.
You could say interest rate for both, and I would say that the government debt kind of forms a floor on the interest rates, and a lot of the other forms of borrowing in the economy are like at a certain level above what the Treasury borrowing rate would be. So if market debt, if Treasury debt gets more expensive, then you would expect that to kind of have an effect on the interest rates of mortgages as well. And if the like we talked about before, the overnight Fed funds rate, which is the rate that banks borrow from each other, if that increases, then that's like the cheapest money you can get because it's just overnight, very low interest rates.
Yeah.
Then that also kind of pushes interest rates up a little bit throughout the economy.
Okay.
So mortgage rates, so if interest rates in general are higher, then you'd expect that to push mortgage rates higher as well.
Sure.
It's not always perfect. Sometimes when the Fed is trying to raise interest rates, the short-term stuff goes up and up and up, but everybody's maybe expecting the economy to crash or expecting interest rates to rapidly come down again, so the long-term interest rates can still be lower. So that's what they call an inverted yield curve, if you guys have ever heard of that. Like on CNBC, they're always like, oh, is the yield curve about to invert? Does that mean we're going to have a recession or something like that? That's when the Fed is trying to push interest rates beyond what the long-term interest rates are.
And that's why you said it was good that they slowly raised them after, I think it was after 2008, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in the past
couple slowly as opposed to too fast or whatever.
Yeah, you don't want to do anything too fast when it comes to this kind of stuff. Except maybe emergency.
It seems like a lot of
bailouts
elasticity though between all the things. I mean, you have to do something and then kind of wait and see what happens.
Yeah, some of it's more connected than not. But yeah, so that's the first part. Just printing money is only going to really lead to inflation once your economy is kind of maxed out in production. Yeah, and then the second thing is. So for the second question, is borrowing money any different than printing money? I think kind of like this is what we talked about before in that it's really not. So borrowing in the sense of budget debt is pretty much the same thing as printing money. You're spending more money into the economy than you're collecting through taxes. Borrowing in the sense of market debt, of course, is a little more complicated because the government can borrow from itself, and the market for treasuries is kind of an independent thing from what the actual debt level is.
Something that I thought was kind of transparent and strange
Yeah.
related to this that I've mentioned to you before is like they talk about how if you print 100 billion or whatever, then you might get inflation.
Yeah.
But then they immediately say that an alternative is to raise the money in the credit markets.
Yeah.
But of course, you would still be spending that money immediately and not paying it back until
Yeah.
later. So it seemed like the logic, and I know we're not trying to pick apart the articles, but it seemed like
No,
the
that's
logic
fine.
was a little strange there, where like if it's going to cause inflation in one case, you're basically doing the exact same action in the short term. So why wouldn't it cause inflation in the second
You're
case?
doing the exact same action both in the short term and the long term. And I think they're thinking of these things as two different things when they're really not.
But I guess I would
Yeah.
say even a standard approach would say you're doing the same thing in the short term. So that's why I thought it was so strange and transparently weird.
Oh, in terms of
Yeah.
spending money into the economy.
Yeah,
and,
I couldn't.
and
I
stimulating
didn't
the
understand
economy.
why this article didn't understand that contradiction. It seemed kind of too blatant and strange.
Yeah, it does seem that way, doesn't it?
So I don't know, but I thought that because I think any economist would recognize that you're spending the money in the economy now, even if they think of it as like something you have to pay back in 10 years or something.
Well, economists think in abstractions and they have models. So a lot of the times they might not be thinking directly about, okay, you're putting something into one part of the economy as opposed to like, another part of the economy or something like that. And I think there's kind of, I don't know, there's this sense that somehow if you keep the budget balanced, then you can spend money and activate parts of the economy that weren't active before. And like when we talk about it here, that doesn't add up, but that's kind of the standard thinking in economics.
But there's no mechanism by which that makes sense in these paragraphs. I'm just saying these paragraphs could be caught by a high school student as a contradiction. I thought it was strange.
They
But
could
the
be
rest
taught
of
by
the
you when you were a high school student.
the rest of the
Yeah.
article was not like that. Like it's just presenting kind of the standard.
So
economics
which
approach.
paragraphs are you looking at in particular?
Another way to
let's-
close the budget gap is to print another 100 billion, but that could
Right.
lead to inflation. Imagine there were the same amount of stuff in the world, but suddenly everyone had twice as much money. So say I'm a high school student, I know nothing. I'm just taking
Right.
them at their word. Okay, if you print money, then there's inflation because you have twice as
Yeah.
much, same amount of stuff. Okay, fine.
So
The
there,
price, and then the price of everything would simply double. But then in
Yeah.
the next thing it says, governments prefer to raise money in the credit markets, which means that they issue bonds, just like private companies. A bond is a promise to pay the money in the future. For example, a 10-year bond, blah, blah, blah. So if I'm just a blank slate mind, it doesn't make any sense because you're just telling me you're raising the money now in a different way, and you're
Yeah.
not paying it back until later.
Yeah,
So
that's good.
if there's the same amount of stuff and twice as much money, you
Yeah.
still have that problem.
That's why I
think you're
asked,
right.
is it cool
I
to
thought that was
equate
strange, yeah.
printing money, just the
Yeah.
term that we say, printing money with, giving out bonds like this? And you said, yes, if you count if you sort of use printing money as an abstraction for like a more complicated
so if you're
thing underneath.
if you're just selling the bonds, if you're just issuing debt, like you could issue a ton of market debt as the government and just not
And then
spend
not.
the money you got.
Yeah.
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 So that's kind of in the
That's
other
like
direction.
giving it to Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, so we talked about how the amount of market debt could be less than the amount of budget debt, but the amount of market debt could also be more than the amount of budget debt. These things are kind of independent things. The government could just issue, they're not going to do this, but they could just issue a bunch of treasury securities and then not spend any extra money, hypothetically. Yeah.
But when you say issue securities,
Yeah.
what we're really saying is sell securities.
And
Yeah.
sell bonds, yeah.
So they're taking in cash and they're replacing it in the market with treasury securities. Yeah.
At a rate that is determined by the market.
Yes.
A price that is determined by the market.
Yes. Yep. So there's still like interest rates and all of that, and that makes things a little more complicated. Yeah. So all the stuff I was saying just now is kind of like abstracting away from the interest rates and stuff, but the interest rates are important mostly for monetary policy. So I think a big mistake they make here is in this sentence. Imagine there were the same amount of stuff in the world, but suddenly everyone had twice as much money. The price of everything would simply double and no one would be any better off. Yeah, so that's true. But you have to imagine that there's the same amount of stuff in the world. You have to imagine that, or when we're talking about realistic, it's about imagining that there's the same amount of production in the economy, but suddenly people are spending twice as much money. So yeah, of course you get inflation. But the idea with basic income and government spending in general is that you're activating more production. So it's not that everyone has the same amount of stuff. If this is going to work, if you can double the amount of spending that everybody's undertaking, then you better be sure that the amount of production will double too. Otherwise, you shouldn't do it. You would get inflation. So that's exactly right. And that's true regardless of kind of whether you borrowed, like in the market or something, or just printed the money. I mean, like if people are spending more, then there better be more production to match it. Yeah.
I think this is a little bit of maybe what's more useful about what I was trying to get at,
Yeah.
which is you hear thrown around the ideas of like stimulus or spending money into the economy, and it just seems like there's not often a lot of clarity in the public discourse about when that is or isn't going to cause inflation and why.
Yeah.
You have a lot of clarity, at least superficially so far as I understand, in the
Yeah.
way that you describe when it is and isn't, right? I'm sure
Yeah.
many other people do too, but at least in the political discourse,
In the political,
it's kind of vague.
it is vague, and it's vague from the economists too. And sometimes there's different economists who are thinking about these different aspects of the system. So sometimes one economist might be thinking about, okay, we got to balance the budget for such and such a reason, and another economist might be thinking about, oh, well, these are the benefits of fiscal stimulus, et cetera, et cetera. And then you kind of like mishmash these two things together, and you get this kind of general sense that, yeah, stimulus can be helpful for the economy, but you don't want to do too much because then the government goes into too much debt or something like that. But it's not like a coherent model or theory.
And I guess what I think is interesting here is like there's just sort of for various reasons, a bad reputation to the idea of printing money. And so people think of inflation more readily there. And if you use a term like stimulus or even like the debt, people don't think of it as quickly. And it's amazing that even in this article, like you're sort of seeing that reflected.
Yeah.
Very transparently, like right next to each other in the paragraphs. But like I think it's that kind of sort of reputation almost based, like heuristic that people use to like what comes to mind when I think about printing money, oh inflation. What comes to mind when I think about stimulus, oh like stimulating productive capacity, right? Like,
yeah. And I think most of the successful money printing in the world is hidden behind, this kind of stuff. It's hidden behind, government borrowing and then central banks, responding and that kind of thing. So you've got all this money printing that's very successful and it's, necessary to kind of sustain economies, but it doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like money printing.
Right.
And then you have these historical examples of blatant money printing where the government is literally, trying to buy as much stuff as possible at the expense of people in the private economy being able to buy stuff because there's like a limited amount of stuff. Germany paying back its war debt after World War I.
Reparations.
They didn't have a choice. That debt was not denominated in their own currency. They had to pay in gold and francs, et cetera, and they just had to buy up as much gold and francs as they could, and they were vastly exceeding what they just lost a war. Right. They were vastly exceeding the amount of money that their productive economy could sustain. Similar thing in Zimbabwe. They were you had all these new farmers who were installed in farms and they didn't really know how to work the land, et cetera, because it had I guess it was a revolution. And now your productive capacity is really hindered, and you're also not great productive capacity anyway. You're not like an industrial nation or whatever. And then meanwhile your government is trying to fund the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, so you're printing money trying to buy all these supplies and whatever to fund this war, and that's exceeding the productive capacity of the economy. I think Venezuela is another example that Nelson brought up last week. They instead of accepting inflation lying down, they put in price controls, so the inflation translates into you just can't buy anything because nothing's available at that price. You keep the price so low that and then maybe there's black markets or something and you see inflation there where you're paying a lot but you can actually get the thing. But they lost productive capacity partly because they broke their economy. They didn't let the markets determine supply and demand. They installed socialism and said like you have to make this much stuff, it has to cost this amount, that kind of thing. So printing money has a pretty bad rap if you look at those examples.
Right, and that's a good point. Yeah, and that's probably where some of this is coming from.
Yeah.
And we don't realize, like maybe we don't realize, like you said, the ways in which we're also doing that, or we call it by a different name.
We call it by a different name. But it's key. It's really important to the economy, and if you're not doing enough of it, then you get bubbles in the financial market. And I can guarantee you that Venezuela is not undergoing a housing bubble right now. That's not their concern. They need to well, they need to do a lot of things. Yeah.
What does it look like when you reach the productive capacity of your economy?
Yeah.
When you hit that point, do you maintain the basic income that you started giving out in order to get to that point?
Mm-hmm.
And then, but then what metric? I mean, do you just use GDP or something? I mean, I don't really know how you measure.
So I have some
It's
opinions
probably really
about.
complicated.
I have some opinions about GDP that I won't get into right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd look at stuff like inflation pressure. So if you're looking at the markets and the Fed is like, oh, we need to keep the currency stable, but now there's, it looks like there's going to be too much inflation, then they raise interest rates. So if you're the government, you look at kind of inflation pressure and, maybe interest rates getting too high. Like if, and maybe you start seeing, businesses that should be able to get funding, not be able to get funding because interest rates are too high and stuff like that. So these kind of various factors. Or maybe you actually do need to start taxing people or certain parts of the economy because you need to free up resources so that prices don't get too high and I don't know. So I would say a combination of inflationary pressure, interest rates getting too high, and the need to start taxing and preventing people from using up too many resources. Then you're kind of like reaching a limit there.
Right. And it's tricky because productive capacity will be fluid, like
Right.
absent war and natural disasters may be generally going up, maybe in some conditions going down. So like you have to be aware of that too with the level. It's not like you just reach one productive capacity
Right.
and then you stay
No,
there
of course,
forever.
and then but you'd be modulating the amount of basic income along with, I guess, I don't know, the interest rate on bonds and stuff too.
Yep.
And then maybe would you ever get to a point where even through this emergent sort of system where the basic income would be $0?
You could imagine an economy like that.
Like, is that not actually the goal? We do the basic income thing in order to figure out what it's like to have a maximally productive economy, and then after a while, would you not just end up with a zero basic income?
No.
Okay.
And that's not the goal either, because
maybe I shouldn't have framed it quite like that.
In order for the economy to keep producing, people need to be able to spend money.
Exactly.
So,
but they're going to be making. I mean, they are going to be making money by working also. So,
if you're imagining a world where production is constrained by labor and somehow magically the amount of income from labor is exactly enough to activate people's productive the economy's
okay, so it's not going to just land there and stick, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I would say that it can't. We can imagine an economy in which resources are really scarce and labor is the most important resource, and if people don't work, then it's a disaster, and then maybe a zero basic income is appropriate there. But as the economy grows, you would expect the amount of basic income that the economy can sustain to be able to grow too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Go ahead, Richard.
You could have a basic income of zero, but you would have the economy would be so efficient that the roll-off of producing everything and whatnot, that you would have everything there would be such a quantity of everything that you wouldn't need. People could just pick up what they wanted.
Need money, everything would be free. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. I've actually heard that before too. Is that eventually we'll break through and there will be machines that can make anything with energy from the sun, and they at the cost of raw materials and blah, blah, blah.
So yeah, there's going to be some of that, and there's always stuff that we have access to in our economy for free. You can breathe this air for free. Not
like
everyone
open
is
source software.
Open source software, all this kind of stuff. But it's important to remember that there's always going to be stuff that people want to buy from each other too. There's always going to be stuff that's going to be.
I mean, innovation.
Yeah, it's not necessarily going to.
Innovation is always valuable for some
Right.
period of time.
And it's not necessarily going to be the stuff that you need to survive. It's not necessarily going to be your basic needs. But there's always going to be interesting stuff that there's a scarcity of, that there's a market for, and people are going to need money to be able to buy that stuff. So, basic income is not necessarily just something about people's basic needs. It's about how to get people the money to buy the stuff that the economy is producing. So that's never going to go away.
It's not just basic needs, it's what the economy is producing.
Right.
That's like a more encompassing.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Did you want to go around with anything, or we're almost done?
Let's go around and get some final thoughts from people. Do you want to start?
I'll go last this time. I always
Okay.
start with Richard.
So Richard, why don't you start?
I don't know what this.
Or you can start too.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't really have any other final thoughts except that I really like this discussion and I like talking about this stuff, and we got to it a little bit last week, and I'm glad we got to explore it more deeply today. Yeah. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm inclined to quote Truman at this point, who said, and I think I already used this quote before, but he asked his advisors to please find him a one-armed economist, because he was tired of economists who said, on the one hand, but then on the other hand.
That's cute.
What you got, Bryant?
I'm not sure. I think I need to take that class.
The money and banking.
Yeah, but I don't know. I definitely learned some things, but it's just gonna take some processing time. I like the idea, and I think I've now cemented it. Although it's still kind of an odd. I don't know. It's very floaty, but the idea that a basic income is not a check that you pay to people. It's like it is an emergent property of an economy that's working at its maximum efficiency. It's a better way of construing it. And that leads me to a question, which maybe I'll ask in a second after we turn this thing off, or now, I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah. So first, listening to this discussion, I've gotten some way through the money and banking class. I think it would be really interesting to a lot of the people here, because it's a lot of the same topics. I find it really interesting the kind of counterintuitive ways that we've been talking about how these different things work. For example, to think of debt as a monetary policy tool instead of something we owe to other people is just very different from how it's thought of in the public sphere. And it reminds me of my studies of cultural evolution, in the sense that it's actually the norm more than the exception in many cases for people to be doing fairly functional things without really understanding conceptually why they're doing them. And there seems like there's a lot of this in what's evolved in the financial system. There's a lot of really functional things happening without conscious understanding necessarily of why. This is at least be Alex's view. But it's interesting that I've studied many other cases, from food processing to health practices, that this is kind of happens all over the place. Just interesting to see it happen in such a modern example that's contemporary to us, because usually we think of ourselves as understanding why we do all the things we do. So I guess that's a final thought
Cool.
I have. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody who's watching it now and watching in the future. All right.